Welcome to the Commercial Awareness Compass. This is your weekly guide to developing your commercial insight in a way that goes beyond just the news. Each week, we focus on one major story, breaking it down to help you build your understanding at 3 levels: beginner, intermediate, and advanced. I'm Tori, I'm a future trainee solicitor, and I'm joined by Henry, a corporate lawyer and content creator. Today's session, we will focus on the sale of Hailey Bieber's makeup brand Rhode to e.l.f. Beauty. So as we go through the beginner, intermediate, and advanced stages, really keep an eye out for how each explanation builds on the last. So we'll start by getting to grips with the basics. Then in the intermediate level, we'll think about how businesses and industries are impacted and how law firms assist. And then finally, in the advanced level, we're looking at that kind of strategic, long-term thinking that goes into helping clients manage these challenges and events. So if we jump straight into the beginner level, Henry, could you please just give us a bit of a background on this story? So really what this deal was, what are some of the key features of the deal?
Yeah, for sure. So as you kindly mentioned, Tori, Hailey Bieber is selling her makeup brand Rhode to e.l.f. Beauty, which is a huge beauty and cosmetics conglomerate, in a deal that's worth up to $1 billion, which I think is around 800 million pounds. And we say up to because we come on to something where part of that is a contingent payment, which we can touch upon further down the line. But I think it's really interesting that this case is a real good example of sort of the intersection between celebrity influence, because we're seeing a lot of celebrities now have or build their own brand off the back of like their online presence, which in itself creates a whole host of issues and points to consider around sort of IP and brand, but also kind of the interplay of legal support and the role of lawyers in trying to kind of help those celebrity brands kind of grow even bigger and kind of exist beyond just the celebrity influence. So yeah, as we mentioned in this section, we can kind of talk about a few of the key details of the matter. And so the transaction itself, we touched upon it being worth up to $1 billion. So that breaks down into 600 million in cash, which is an insane amount, 200 million in stock, and also an additional potential 200 million contingency payment. And that will be based on, so contingent on basically means this payment is payable based on something happening. And that something happening it will be the company's performance. Obviously, we don't know the ins and outs of what the contract says around what the thresholds are for what payments to be made. But what we can deduce is that if the company performs well over the next 3 years, then an additional up to sum of 200 million will be paid, which is crazy for a brand that has only existed since 2022, so around almost 4 years. It's also interesting that whilst Hailey Bieber is the celebrity in the face of this brand, there is always a risk that when you have a celebrity brand, the brand is that individual. So if that organization or company is sold to a huge entity like e.l.f., there's a risk that the brand and the brand's sort of goodwill also falls away with that. So interestingly, we're seeing Hailey stay on as sort of chief creative officer and head of innovation. So she will still be fully embedded within this brand. So some of the key things whilst we're in this beginner section that make this deal stand out is how fast this company has grown. So it's reached its 1 billion valuation within the 3 years, as we've just spoken about, which is unreal. And I think that reinforces the celebrity influence and the brand success that we've seen with this brand and a lot of other sort of celebrity-led beauty ventures. I also think for those that are watching, law students, potential future trainees, one of the really interesting points around this topic in this deal, for example, is one, it showcases the various different roles and legal aspects that will need to be involved, such as the mergers and acquisitions side of things, the intellectual property that will be involved in this, how it's going to be structured, and also regulatory compliance. And I think that's just reinforcing what our role as lawyer is in this kind of scenario. We won't just be saying we need to do X, Y, and Z for both e.l.f. and for Rhode Beauty, Hailey and team. There will be lawyers on either side sort of talking around the commercialities of this, what we want this deal to look like, what are the various sort of factors that get involved in this, which I think is really exciting.
Absolutely. I think also that was such a great explanation at the beginner level, because a story like this kind of acquisition would be something that would commonly come up in a case study, in an assessment center or something like that. I even remember that I did a negotiation exercise that related to some kind of acquisition. And at that point, I actually wasn't that familiar with how these kind of deals are paid for, the kind of pricing structure. So I think it is super helpful that you laid out that there is this agreed payment of what money is going to change hands now, but then also this contingent payment that can come in the future. So I think it is really good for our listeners to be aware of that. The other thing that you pointed out that I thought was really helpful actually is this idea of that there's this rapid growth behind a company that is led by a celebrity, but then you said that of course there's that risk that the brand's success really comes down to that celebrity's presence. And so there is that commercial sense in having a celebrity like Hailey Bieber in this case remain involved. And I just love that you pointed that out, because I think to me that shows a perfect example of why I think listening to commercial awareness podcasts like this is so useful. Because when you said that, I thought, oh, that actually seems like such an obvious point that I hadn't actually thought of. But I think it's just practicing this skill of thinking those things through and really thinking about the commercial sense and consideration behind these decisions. So I love that you pointed that out. Was there anything you wanted to add at the beginner level before we move into intermediate?
Yeah, I think I fully agree with everything you just said. I would just add on the example point is we briefly spoke about this in terms of these scenarios. A lot of assessment center scenarios are largely based off of real life examples. So it's really good to kind of get an understanding of how these sort of deals look, because on the face of it, you just see $1 billion and you think this person's being paid $1 billion, but actually when you break it down, it's arguably only $800 million, 600 of which is cash, the other 200 is stock and 200 is potential. So kind of understanding how these work. So you'll probably likely come across something similar on your assessment. So having an idea of this, I think really equips students and future trainees with just kind of their eye ready to kind of look on these sort of issues and points.
Yeah, for sure. I think that's a good tool for people to have, of just, if you're given this kind of example, then think about what is that 1 billion comprised of, because it might not just be pure cash. So it's really good to pause and think about that. So if we move into the intermediate now, I think this builds quite nicely upon what you laid out in the beginner stage, because you were talking about this rapid growth of Rhode as a brand. So I think we can think at this stage about what's the kind of legal advice that a founder like Hailey Bieber would have had throughout the kind of life cycle of this business. So, because it has really quickly moved from just starting out to now being acquired. So what kind of legal advice do you think would come throughout each stage?
I think we've seen quite a lot of this in terms of celebrity-led brands or influencer-led brands, in terms of you have a following, you have a sort of a cohort of community of people, and you build a brand that your community and the wider masses globally love. But I think there's a stark difference between being a sort of celebrity and endorsing various other brands to then actually building your own brand. And I think these brands are, whilst they have like resource and backing because of the status of these individuals, they do go through a lot of the same phases as a lot of sort of startup companies do. We have sort of the startup phase, the initial kind of phasing, the growth phase, and then ultimately, as we're seeing now with Rhode exit, the CEO, the founder wants to exit because then they can cash in on the brand that they've built. So I think in terms of how the legal teams would kind of support that is ultimately we need to start in the sort of the setting up phase. The formation is, what is this company going to be structured like? Obviously, company structures in the US are slightly different to here in the UK, but ultimately they need to be set up as some kind of vehicle, LLC or whatever that may be in the US. and have all of the foundational documents, the shareholders agreements, the articles of association, the funding documents. Again, if it's a celebrity-backed brand, we want to make sure that their trademark, their intellectual property, that is a large part of what the brand is. We want to make sure that that is protected. And also, if it's a specific brand, like we've seen with Hailey and the makeup industry, there may be, we've seen it with some regulatory points as well in terms of celebrity brands around like alcohol and drinks. What is the regulatory compliance? And are there any specific aspects that they need to comply with? I don't know if we've got those listening. We may have students, future lawyers that are working on their own side hustle, business ventures, and they'll be going through these kind of phases, but on a slightly smaller scale, unless you're watching and you are a celebrity. Then we have the growth phase where we then start working with the suppliers. Who's going to supply the makeup? Who's going to create and distribute the makeup? A lot of beauty-led brands then work with influencers to reach a even wider audience to market and promote the product. What do those contracts look like? How do we negotiate them? Who's working on them? That will be for the commercial team. The team that Hailey started with is likely going to grow. So then we would need the employment team to come in to kind of advise on how do we employ people? Do we just take on contractors? Do we have part-time? What are the regulations around that? How are we selling these products and to whom are we selling them? So we want to engage with the e-commerce team. We want to potentially have a website. What does our privacy policy look like? What data are we using and collecting from our consumers? So we need to make sure that we are complying with the relevant data protection provisions, depending on this jurisdiction that we're selling to. And then ultimately, when the company gets to a point where the founders think, we've grown a lot, we are ready to exit, we're ready to sort of cash in and sell this company to a bigger organization. And that could be for a whole host of reasons. Perhaps they've reached their growth that they could do on their own. They need like a huge e.l.f, like ginormous conglomerate that can take them to that next level. What the corporate mergers and acquisitions lawyers will need to be looking at is, let's get the company ready for acquisition. How is that acquisition going to look like? How are you going to structure it? A share sale, that was hard to say, or an asset sale. What are we selling here? Let's get all the DD ready. Let's go and negotiate the sale. What are the terms of the sale? What do we want this to look like? And then also we have, when huge companies are being bought and sold, again, the regulatory compliance aspects of that to ensure that the sale, the merger, however we're going to structure this, isn't going to be flagged and blocked by the relevant sort of competitions and markets agency for, this will be in the US, but if it were in the UK, the CMA.
Thanks so much for outlining that. I feel like that is a really helpful guide for the different things that lawyers would have been advising Rhode on. So then if we kind of look from the alternate perspective, if we think of e.l.f. Beauty, who has purchased Rhode, what are the kinds of things that their lawyers would have been looking out for and advising them on whether or not it would be wise to purchase this company?
Yeah, absolutely. As we touched on, that the Rhode Beauty brand, its biggest asset is that it is attached to Hailey Bieber. She is the brand. People are buying these products because of her. So e.l.f. will want to make sure that, again, we focus on the IP side of things, that all of the intellectual property within both registered and unregistered in the organization, when they buy it, will come with the purchase that they're making, and it's free of dispute. They're not in like litigation with another company, are the terms and the use of that intellectual property. Because if you're buying a celebrity-backed brand because of their celebrity status and that influence, but actually you realize all of the trademarks and the names associated with it are being contested and disputed by a third party, that kind of minimizes the value of what that asset is, the asset being the intellectual property. Regulatory compliance as well. We want to make sure that when we're doing our DD on the company that we're buying, because you'll have a team of lawyers acting for the buyer who will do their due diligence on the seller, whereby the seller is required to kind of provide a whole host of information and background material on the company so that we, the buyers, can fully understand what we are buying. Because in sort of when we're buying a company, you may have come across it on your studies, depending on what level you're at. We have the contra preferentum rule, which is buyer beware. So ultimately, the buck stops with the buyer to make sure that they're doing their DD and they're fully understanding what they're buying. And that's our role, acting for the buyer. We also want to make sure that when we've got the funding to be able to buy it, so we'll be working with the banking and finance team to work out how we're going to fund finance this purchase. And also any existing contracts, any disputes, any employment, any financial liabilities. Through doing our DD, that's how we'll kind of understand what we're looking at and what we're going to be buying.
Sorry, I think I cut out for a second, but I'm back. Can you hear me well?
Yes, you're all good. Yeah.
Okay, perfect. It's stormy outside. I don't think that's helping. But so I think before we move on from the intermediate stage, I think what is always helpful to give our viewers as well is like an idea of what are the kinds of things that they might be involved in as trainees. So in a deal like this, what would a trainee's role look like?
We spoke a lot then, or I spoke a lot then, around due diligence and due diligence exercising done by the buyer, and also where the buyer is asking questions around the company. The seller will need to be providing certain documents and answering certain questions. Managing a data room, which is where all of that information will sit, managing the DD and disclosure exercises is something that you will definitely be assisting on as a trainee and even an associate. You'll be doing a lot of the research and a lot of the due diligence exercises that comes with it. You'll be managing timelines. You'll be kind of doing a lot of project management elements of it, tracking where documents are, tracking who documents are with, what's outstanding. You may, depending on the firm that you're at and the team that you're in, be assisting in drafting a lot of the legal documents and key contracts that will sit as part of this. You may be involved with like adding to and contributing or reviewing certain provisions within an SPA or an APA, depending on how the share purchase agreement or asset purchase agreement, depending on how the sale is structured. And they're quite hefty documents. So having time to kind of look at certain parts and sections, I think will be a really fun exercise for a lot of juniors. You'll also be involved with a lot of the calls and discussions around these sales, whether that's kind of contributing, taking notes, which I think will fully embed you in kind of what are the key risks for buyers and sellers. And that's something that comes up a lot in assessment centers and sort of more practical assessments is you'll get an example or a scenario, and whilst you can list off loads of things that they should be considering, what you need to always keep in mind is who are we acting for, because what you're looking for is a buyer and what you're looking for is a seller. There's a whole different sort of set category of what is your primary focus. And when you're drafting something, the agreement, depending on if you're acting for the buyer or the seller, the drafting and the language that you want is going to be different, because the seller just wants to sell the company at the best price it can, doesn't really care too much, it just wants it gone and it wants the cash. Whereas the buyer wants to be paying a price that's fair and reasonable, but they want to be making sure that they're buying something that's relatively low risk. You don't want to be buying a company thinking you're buying one thing and then suddenly you get hit with a whole host of issues and challenges and claims.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks so much for outlining that. I think it's also always nice to put it into perspective that these commercial stories, they're not just abstract things. I think when when people are applying for training contracts, it can feel like it's this faraway thing, but actually, yeah, it's nice to picture yourself actually being involved in it and doing this kind of stuff. And I love also the assessment center insights. Those are always useful. So if we move into the advanced section then, what I was wondering about that we could start here, because at the advanced level for our listeners, our viewers, really at an advanced level, we're thinking long-term and strategically. So in the context of this story, what are the kind of long-term legal considerations that would make a business like Rhode attractive to buyers?
For me, I think one of the biggest assets of a brand like Rhode is how quickly it's grown in such a short amount of time. And I think having that celebrity-backed brand, having that hot topic, robust IP portfolio is because I think from doing my readings around this, the company itself only has a very select handful of products. So it doesn't have like a huge product library and catalog. So the real value is in the brand and the quality of those products. So having that then gives space for the company to grow and maybe add a few more products in the future and additional product designs, which then can increase the IP portfolio. The contracts and the growth of the company just kind of allows continued growth, and being bought by a company like e.l.f. will allow for that company to be taken to the next level. And there may be subsidiaries in the future. We've got, this is primarily beauty focused, but you could see this company having an athleisure side company to this, whether it's under the same brand name or something else. You can see it having a health and wellness supplements angle to it. And that's something that when you're thinking of this brand, where can I take it? They're the sorts of things that a buyer will be looking at. How can we use this brand? How can we use this celebrity name to kind of build like a sort of empire around what this is, which I think is really exciting. And I think offers a buyer like e.l.f. so much.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, yeah, it is exciting to think what else they could do in the future. And so then if we think as well about the strategic thinking behind law firms as a business as well, how might a law firm position themselves to be, the right firm for a business like Rhode to be scaling up, or, founder-led brands like that?
I think with a founder-led brand like Rhode, what the role of the law firm is to look at that, and it's a very sort of cross-practice approach to this is what the company is, but there, as we spoke about, there are so many different angles: employment, finance, banking, and working with founder-led companies. It's ultimately something that the law firms will kind of get more of an understanding, because when you've got a founder-led company, whilst it could be a huge celebrity-backed brand, it's still a relatively new company. So that will have a lot of different issues and concerns that, say, a more established household name or brand would have. So what we're seeing is a lot of firms now have specific teams and groups that are focused on SMEs, startups, whether or not the firm offers like incubators or specialized webinars and offerings and training courses for sort of founder-led businesses, things to look out for in your contracts. How are these companies going to, these founder-led startup companies going to actually fund legal services? We need to be thinking about offering unique and flexible payment offerings, because startups generally don't have lots of money until they get their funding, and however the sort of the finances are structured, but that could take a while, and they perhaps don't want to be spending a lot of their funding on legal services. So how can we offer unique financing offerings and levels of support to SMEs, to founder-led businesses, that one isn't going to bankrupt them, but also isn't going to put them off of wanting to engage lawyers and legal services, which ultimately they want, because they don't want to put themselves at risk when working with third parties, finance providers, etc. But also a lot of founders are inclined to kind of do things by themselves, or we found this on Google, when actually us as lawyers will look at that and think, that's risky, but why didn't you do that? So we can provide a sort of one-stop shop legal services, flexible support, and flexible financing for SMEs, I think that's going to definitely distinguish a few law firms in that space.
For sure. And I think like my final question, it just kind of is building upon that, because so if it is of benefit for founders to be seeking legal advice, then really what is the kind of legal advice, the kind of legal strategy that law firms can assist them with that would then distinguish a good brand from a buyable brand?
Yeah, for sure. So when companies are looking to be acquired and bought, what they ultimately want to do is make themselves look and be as sort of saleable as possible. Basically have all of your ducks in a row. And to have all of your ducks in a row, you kind of want to have the legal support from the outset. So you're not a organization or a startup that's had a whole host of sort of regulatory challenges. You've had IP trademark disputes, you've had X, Y, and Z. If you can get the support from the outset, that's going to make your kind of track history look a lot better, a lot cleaner, and it's going to be a good, valuable brand that's kind of free of kind of risk, because ultimately a buyer wants to buy a company that's as risk-free as possible, and that comes through having sort of the legal support from the outset. And having a sort of lawyer and legal team support you, the lawyers will know the changes that are coming up in the law a lot better and a lot more ahead of time than you as a founder or an SME owner, because you're busy. Founders, SMEs are juggling lots of hats. The teams are relatively small, budgets are relatively constrained. So having a lawyer saying, by the way, chaps, by the way, guys, these regulatory changes are coming down the line. This new law is coming into effect that may affect how your SME operates. We should start thinking about this. The sooner you can start doing that sort of stuff as an SME, the more less at risk you're going to be, and you can kind of deal with issues early on rather than the last minute and having to throw like time and resource at something, a problem that could have been prevented just by kind of having that strategic and legal sort of foresight.
For sure. Thank you so much. I don't have any other questions unless you had anything else that you wanted to add before we wrap up.
No, I don't think I have anything further on this one.
No, I think it was really comprehensive, really helpful. And like we spoke about at the beginning, this type of story is something likely to come up in an assessment center. So I think this has been really, really useful. So thank you so much for your insights. And thank you to our viewers, listeners, for joining today's Commercial Awareness Compass. Remember that commercial awareness is not just staying on top of the news and repeating the headlines that you hear. It is really about understanding why these events matter to clients and how you as a future lawyer can provide that strategic value, which I think this episode has outlined really well, the kind of ways that lawyers do provide that strategic value. So thank you so much again, Henry. And to our viewers, join us next week to keep building your commercial awareness. And until then, prepare without the panic.